We will end Chapter 3 by talking about extinction and theories of conditioning. To start, you might be wondering after videos 1 and 2 how exactly it's possible to stop having an association between two variables you've become conditioned to associate with one another. This process is called extinction. And this is when the conditioned stimuli is repeatedly presented or occurs in the environment without the unconditioned stimuli. So think for a second, after Pavlov trained his dog to associate the sound of the metronome with food, he does that, the dog learns that the metronome means food is coming, but for a period of time afterwards, Pavlov just played the metronome and never fed the dog. After that happens, the conditioned response becomes weaker and weaker. Over time, you actually stop associating the two together because you learn that one doesn't necessarily mean the other. We lose that consistency between the presentation of the two variables. Extinction, however, is not the same thing as forgetting. We don't necessarily forget that that association was there. We just learn that we don't have the same level of contingency. Remember talking about contingency in the last video. Forgetting is when there's a deterioration in performance following a period without practice. So, practice meaning trials. We forget when we're not allowed to practice for a period of time or the variables are not present in our environment for a long period of time. Extinction happens when those variables are presented, but we lose that contingency. Practice continues, but the pairing is disconnected and the CSUS contingency dissolves. That's extinction. Interestingly enough, we know that sometimes after extinction, something called spontaneous recovery can occur. And this is where we see a reappearance of the conditioned response after extinction. So without another period of training, the dog heard the metronome without food for a long period of time, and then one day heard the metronome and started salivating again. And that can happen sometimes. Usually under extreme circumstances, but it does occasionally happen. So extinction doesn't necessarily mean that that behavioral reflex pairing is completely lost. It's just not going to necessarily occur as often. We want to finish this chapter by looking at some theories of conditioning. So these theories have taken a shot at explaining why exactly it's possible to learn these associations. The first theory, stimulus substitution theory, was actually presented by Pavlov himself. Sorry about the animation problem here, but bear with me just a second. Pavlov thought that the physiological mechanisms involved in reflexes were what allowed us to form these associations. And that makes sense because we know that reflexes play a role in the conditioned stimuli, conditioned response, unconditioned stimuli, unconditioned response relationship. So Pavlov thought that in an innate reflex or an inborn reflex, the unconditioned stimulus actually activates nerve fibers in your brain. In turn, that stimulates other nerve fibers that evoke that unconditioned response. This forms a neural link in our brain. And he thought that after conditioning, the conditioned stimulus activates that same nerve fiber or that link of neurons in the brain. So basically he thought that the unconditioned stimulus and conditioned stimulus are just two things that stimulated the same part of the brain, which is interesting and does make sense. However, we have evidence that suggests that the CR and the UR are not necessarily the same because the conditioned response can be weaker than the unconditioned response. It can also be less reliable and appear or happen slower than the unconditioned response. And that's not possible if all that was happening was the same regions of the brain being stimulated. So then we have something called the preparatory response theory. And this theory states or theorized that the unconditioned response is innate and designed to deal with the conditioned stimuli. We have this response, we're born with it, and that response allows us to process or handle the unconditioned stimuli. This researcher thought that the conditioned response is meant to allow our bodies to prepare for the inevitable appearance of the unconditioned stimuli and the unconditioned response. So it's not necessarily that our brains were stimulating the same area, but rather we learn that we need to get ready for that stimulation to occur and prepare for the response. A similar theory, called the compensatory response theory, thought that the conditioned response prepares an animal for the unconditioned response, just like with the preparatory response theory, but it does it by compensating for its effects. So the conditioned response appears, the conditioned stimuli appears. We know that that means the unconditioned stimuli is going to appear, do something to our bodies, so our body needs to get ready for that. This theory actually goes a long way towards explaining suppressive responses and drug users. If you're familiar with tolerance, which we'll actually talk about in the next lecture in chapter 4, our bodies get used to drugs over time. And in fact, our bodies can actually begin to experience tolerance or show signs of preparing for a drug without the drug entering our system. So compensatory response theory theorizes that the conditioned response is potentially a smaller version of the unconditioned response that kind of prepares us for what's coming. The next theory is called conditional awareness, and this theory is pretty straightforward. It states that the conditioned response is the result of being aware that we've been conditioned. We know that metronome means food. I hear metronome, I expect food. And while that does make sense, we actually know that conditioning can occur without us being aware of it. So this does not always account for why conditioning happens. It might explain it sometimes. Many of these theories can be used in specific examples, but not necessarily explain all instances of classical conditioning. The kind of current theory that's been the most influential over the past 40 years is called the Wagner model. I always mispronounce the first name there, so we're just going to call it the Wagner model. And this posits that we can actually explain classical conditioning by using a mathematical equation. I am not going to ask you to use this equation or do anything with it, but I do want to walk you through it. This theory posits or kind of proposes that there's a limit to the amount of conditioning that can occur. The limit depends on characteristics of the stimuli. Certain stimuli will only allow us to undergo a certain degree of learning. It also posits that each successive pairing produces less learning, and we can figure out how much learning this will produce by using this equation. So quickly to walk you through this equation, it involves the amount of change at any given trial, the strength of the association, how strongly I associate the metronome with the food, how many trials we've been through, a constant, a number that's consistent between 0 and 1 that changes depending on the situation, and then the total amount of learning that can still occur. So basically, if you want to predict the amount of learning on a given trial, you subtract the amount of learning that's already occurred from the maximum amount of learning possible, and that tells you what the potential for that specific trial is. And this theory has just gone a long way to build off of those previous theories that we talk about that kind of got more at the abstract idea of why exactly conditioning happens and gives us a more concrete, usable interpretation of conditioning. That's all for chapter 3. Please feel free to email me if you have any questions or would like to go over any concepts in more detail.